take some questions right now. All right. Yeah, and let's keep our questions short and concise. I know a lot of people like to make statements beforehand, but we have a lot of people, and one-liners, please.
I won't make a statement, but I will ask two questions. One is, has there been a removal? I've heard this at this conference before, it hasn't been mentioned. Has there been a removal of the Soviet bloc stations that are in the Arctic that could be affecting the so-called average temperature? And this question is for Anthony Watts. How come there hasn't been a big push to look at the Raywinson data? Now, I did this at NOAA for many years. I don't know if anybody's looking at it, but part of the global warming argument involves the temperatures in the lower troposphere, not just surface temperatures. I think the Raywinson data needs to be looked at again. So that the first question is about the Soviet bloc and then Raywinson.
I should explain. I have a hearing impairment. I have about an 85% hearing loss, so I didn't hear most of your question. Dr. Richard Keene is going to interpret for me, and I'll answer.
Yeah, so question in a nutshell would be, is there a reduction in stations in the Soviet Union after 1990? And how come more people aren't looking at Raywinson data instead of surface and satellite?
Okay. Yes, there was a reduction in stations in the Soviet Union after the Cold War ended. There was also an equivalent reduction in stations in the northern Canada Dewline from the United States at the same time. Basically, when the Cold War ended, the need for these high-latitude radar stations disappeared, and each one of these radar stations had a weather station, and they would go out and measure the temperature regularly. There's an interesting story behind that, in that a lot of the readings, we are told, from these stations, both in Russia and in Canada, were sometimes manufactured for a couple of reasons. When the temperature is minus 40 or minus 60 degrees outside and it's blowing 30 knot winds, do you really want to go out and measure the temperature, or do you just really say it's probably about minus 45 degrees centigrade? That's one reason. The other reason is polar bears. I have accounts on my blog of polar bear confrontations where they just said, okay, I'm not going out and getting that reading. My life is not worth a temperature reading. And so they wouldn't bother. They would just guesstimate it. Another issue had to do with the fact that in Russia, if it was colder and you reported it was colder, you'd get more heating fuel and other supplies. And so there was a bias to report colder. And so the record itself probably wasn't all that good. But yeah, there was a lot of loss of it.
Did you want to comment on the radioson?
I can't hear you.
Oh.
The radiosons.
Oh, yeah. As far as radiosonde data, I don't really have a good answer for that as to why more people are not looking at it. Partly it may be due to the fact that it's not as easily accessible as the surface data.
Yeah, and your first question is relevant about the Dewline stations and Soviet stations, because there's a lot of stations, on that animation I had, a lot of stations had a lifetime of 30, 40, 50, 60 years, and then they shut down, which means if you want to go back 100 years, you've got to start splicing stations in together, which starts generating a lot of mischief depending on the splicer and the splicee. And, and also a short station, 50 years, that's going to get one part of the PDO cycle or AM, some of these cycles, so it's not going to get a long-term trend. It's going to get the shorter-term things. So the short duration of a lot of stations is an issue, and there are very few, as that slide, again, from Wikipedia showed. Not many stations have the full 100 years or, some suitable time period. Continuous, where you can have some confidence that that single station is giving you meaningful information.
I would appreciate if Anthony could comment regarding the best temperature studies from Berkeley.
Okay, comment on the best from Berkeley, the Berkeley best data.
The Berkeley best methodology tried to do a better job than NOAA, and I applaud them for that effort. However, just like all the other data sets, they all source back to the NOAA data set, and as I've demonstrated here, that NOAA data set is polluted with a majority of inappropriately cited stations and other issues. And so even though their methodology is doing a better job at trying to deal with the slices like Dr. Keene was talking about related to, 30-year stations and so forth, or station moves, and they did a very good job of that. They still have not been able to address the issue of the long period signals like UHI, and they admit to this, that their methodology doesn't address slow long period signals like UHI particularly well, and neither does the NOAA methodology or GIS. And they're, of course, not able to pay attention to station sighting. What I hope is when we finally get our paper published, and we're in the final bits of that now, that we'll have that data set available for everyone, and they can go back and look at that and see how they can deal with their methodology appropriately.
Yeah, and I believe, well, I compared, actually two of my slides was Colorado. One was a old NCDC, pre-adjustment days, pretty much raw data, and then BEST. And the basic Colorado data has about 1/2 degree of warming since 1849. BEST has about 2 degrees of warming since 1820. Now, there were no stations in Colorado or anywhere near it until 1849, when Santa Fe and, some regional stations. So they were estimating from Sitka, Alaska, and Minneapolis for Colorado. But also they introduced sawtooth adjustments where they use homogenization, comparison between two stations, to look for a discontinuity in one of the two stations, and then would apply discontinuous adjustment. And as always happens, those adjustments tend to be upwards with time. So I do have some real questions about the way they blended together and did this sawtooth adjustment.
This is a question for probably Anthony. The zombie stations that they've closed, did they purge the data from those stations back a certain period of time?
Have zombie stations been purged from the data?
Now, what he's referring to is a term I coined, zombie stations. The Marysville station that I showed a picture of, and the University of Arizona at the Atmospheric Sciences Department station that I showed a picture of, are still reporting data, even though the stations are closed. And I call these zombie stations. And the reason they're still reporting data is that someone at NCDC had a meeting and decided that we need to maintain the continuity of the record. And it had to do with homogenization and the plane of temperature that they were trying to produce. And so what they're doing is they're creating zombie data from infilling stations around it. And as I've demonstrated, the majority of stations they're using for infilling are corrupted by sighting or other issues. And so what they're creating is zombie data that has a warm bias to it. And I consider the practice reprehensible, really. I mean, imagine if you were to go into court and say, Your Honor, I'm sorry, the original data, we lost that. So we're going to take some things here that look similar that were around the crime scene, and we'll interpolate from that, and that's our evidence. Can you imagine the reaction to that?
Yeah, and as I mentioned, that happens on the global scale too. There's no stations over the South Atlantic, so they make them up and put the data in there. But we'll comment that one station in Utah is not a zombie station. Looks like the observer's still in the grave.
Yeah.
Could I ask a question?
I haven't checked to see if that station is closed or not, but that's a good point.
This has gone on long enough because you could spend another hour on this. Could I ask a question to Larry, please? What evidence does he have that the policymakers in energy policy, decarbonizing and getting rid of coal, that they actually believe the science they used to justify? Does he have any evidence for that?
I said I just speculate that whether people know it or not, this is what's going on. In certain cases, it's more plausible that people are spiking. Well, you've heard some examples from the temperature data, but my main thrust is the methodological issue. So I really hate to get into motivations, to tell you the truth, because because I'll tell you the reason I hate to get into motivations. I've been so wrong so many times that I think I got myself the message to just try and stick with the evidence and deal with a back and forth pertaining to the evidence and stay out of the motivational area.
Billions of dollars have been spent on the Argos buoy system. Is there any temperature data out to the public?
What was the question?
Billions spent on the Argos buoy system or buoy system, and is the data available to the public? And I don't know.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of experience with the Argo data. Willis Eschenbach is our specialist at WWT on that, but I can tell you that it is available to the public. It's also a very short period of record, and so it doesn't really have a whole lot of bearing on things just yet. It may in the future.
Gould, that was an excellent talk. It was built on logic and void of hypocrisy. My question to you, sir, is how do you handle the debate with people who dismiss logic and promote hypocrisy?
Well, I have a bit of an optimistic streak in me, and I used to think more optimistically that if I present a good rational argument, the person will just kind of flop over and say, "Oh, thank you, I see the light." That's not the way people work, okay? And when I find out that after back and forth that I'm not making any headway, respectfully say thanks for your opinion and go on my way. Yeah.
All right, last question. Who wants it most? All right.
A few years ago, if my memory isn't betraying me, the United States had a winter that was not just record warm, but by such a large amount that it was cited as evidence for a rising temperature trend. Would this extreme record warmth of that winter, could that be attributed, at least in good part, to the kinds of measurement biases that you've been discussing?
Do you remember what winter that was you're talking about?
Just 2 or 3 years ago. It was just 2 or 3 years
Probably
ago.
2012, because that was the, quote, warmest year of record.
It could be.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. So talking about the record warm winter of 2012 being, several standard deviations or whatever above, and was that reality or confirmation bias in the data? Would that?
Well, I just had a post up on this that this record that NOAA uses to determine temperature is a living, breathing animal. It changes daily. And I had a blog post showing that the July 1936 had changed its position again to be the hottest month on record. And so you can look at and watch July 2012 and compare it to July 1936, and I realize that's not the winter because I don't have any basis to talk about the winter. I haven't studied that particular part. But I can tell you that that record changes constantly. I believe that there was some bias to the numbers. The winter was, yes, warm, and there were other natural factors and natural variations involved in making that happen. But some of the data, as I've demonstrated, has a warm bias to it. And so, whether or not it's going to maintain to be, the warmest winter on record is yet to be seen based on the fact that NCDC keeps adjusting this stuff on a daily basis.
And they adjusted over the decades, too. So relative to 2012, 1934 has gone up or down, mostly down 1 degree or so, and 2012 relatively has gone up a degree simply because of these inserted adjustments. And you're talking about very small differences now. When you're talking global temperatures, the whole range of it is in the 1 degree or less range. So when you start doing 1 degree adjustments, you're really changing the answer.
All right, I think that'll do us for now.
Yeah. All right.